So actually we want to make this a pilot house. So we start taking beams off the boat to put them up here.
Oh, interesting.
Or boom gallows.
Hey guys, welcome back to the boatyard. So, I've got a confession to make. We have been procrastinating a really big thing for a really long time, and I think we finally have to deal with it. Pretty soon, we have to leave the States and return to Europe to reset our visas. But before we do, there's one big project that we want to complete. The only problem? We still aren't quite sure what this project actually is. I just got off a phone call with my dad. So we wanted to get his advice on a topic that we've been struggling with, and that is the topic of this beam which runs behind me. This beam runs the entire width of the boat from beam shelf to beam shelf, and it supports the cabin tops, it supports the deck, and most importantly, in a way, it kind of supports all the other beams because this beam supports the carlin. The carlin runs into it, and all these other beams go into the carlin. So if this beam fails, the carlin sinks down, and all of our brand new beams sink down with it. Now this beam is pretty rotten on the ends. It is even more rotten than a lot of the short beams, which we went to all the trouble of replacing. So it seems clear to us that this beam needs to be repaired or replaced. And this is where the mystery begins, because replacing this beam means we have to first answer a series of questions and retrace clues back in time to figure out what's actually going on here. There have already been some repairs going on around this beam, and those repairs are rather perplexing. So basically, there's another beam sistered onto this beam. Sistering is basically just when you make a parallel beam and you stick them together with through bolts and glue. And the idea is that the new beam should hold the loads that the original beam was intended to hold. But this sistered beam doesn't actually run the full width of the boat. It actually stops just shy of the beam shelf on either side. This is perplexing because it's the beam shelf that holds the beam at either end. So if you really wanted a sistered beam to hold the loads that the original beam was intended to take, the sistered beam would need to sit on the beam shelf. As it is, it's kind of just hovering in space. It's not really sitting or supported by anything. This perplexed us for a while, but I'm going to get into the reason why I think they did that, and it's not great. The only reason this sister could be useful is to support the plywood decks from above. Now, why would we need an additional beam to help support the plywood decks from above? The only reason you could need that is if the original beam was rotted on the top. And there is quite a bit of evidence to suggest that it could have been. Now, we cannot see the top of the beam at all because it's hidden behind the teak trim on this side and behind the sister on the other side and by the decks on the top. So all we can see is the bottom edge. But if you look at our plywood decks from above, there have obviously been some repairs made in the plywood. So it seems highly probable that the bridge deck was rotting at one point and somebody went in to make a repair, wanted to replace the plywood, realized that the top of this beam was pretty severely rotten so that it couldn't even support the plywood anymore, and thought, well, heck, I don't want to go through all the trouble of replacing this beam. I don't blame them. And so they just decided to put a sister here. And the only way to find out if the middle of the beam is rotten is by opening the decks.
You are putting the pressure on me. All this drama for the video is making me respect this task more and more. I think I have a very good game plan. It's more just about starting.
We gotta create a little bit. I mean, that is the situation. I'm not kidding about any of it.
That was right.
Perhaps the only part that is less dramatic than what I said is in your ability to do it.
We can both do it together.
Yes.
And let's not forget that we were intending to open the decks here anyway. And that is because of this puzzle of so many different pieces of plywood. And we'll try to cover as much area with a full sheet of plywood afterwards again.
When Aladino and I first decided to tackle this beam project, we discussed scarfing in new ends to replace the rotten sections. We discussed building a knee joint to support the beam on either side from below. But with the condition of the center of the beam also being in question, we realized that if we wanted to have confidence in this very important structural piece, we'd have to investigate further. Still, we were really hoping to find a solution that means we don't have to completely replace the beam, because it's not easy and there are actually risks involved. The first complication is with how the carlin leads into the beam. So on either side the carlin leads in, and we're assuming probably on an angled cut that's sort of notched into this big beam. So if we decide to replace this beam completely, we're going to have to very carefully chisel out the end of the carlin from within the beam and try not to damage the end of the carlin. The second big complication is in these big draw bolts. And I don't know if I'm using that term correctly. That's what Aladino has been calling them, so I'm going with that. There's these large bolts that go up through the bottom of the beam all the way up through the cabin side, pretty much to the top. And in order to get them out, you actually have to dig into the teak trim up here. Okay, so that's a difficult thing to get out. We were hoping it wouldn't come to that. As Aladino slowly excavated the beam, we almost held our breath with anticipation.
There goes the last of the fiberglass, and now we get onto the plywood. I don't exactly know what machine to use to make the cut in the plywood, because I have to be exactly on the face of the cabin top. So power tool is going to be hard. I have a router with an offset tip, but that's leaving some distance off of it as well. Only the fine, but the fine is challenging with the depth adjustment.
Aladino decided to use the oscillating multi-tool, or the fine, and made a line to mark the depth of the cut. He'd have to work very carefully. If he let the tool slide in too deep, then he'd risk cutting into the beam, and we want to do everything we can to preserve the beam. Though of course, we'd only know for sure if we're able to, once we open things up and figure out just what we're working with. Just like that, it has gotten more difficult to move around our boat. When Aladino lifted away the last of the plywood, we laid our eyes on the beam for the first time. So we were right, it is rotten.
It was rotten.
It was rotten.
Well, that's why they put the sister there.
Yeah.
Because they have made repairs and then they wanted to strengthen it again. So.
But fortunately, they did also repair the beam itself. They didn't only add the sister. Do you want to point that out?
There is a cut made here in the original beam. This is the original beam.
It's hard to see. Wait, let me, can you shine your light on it? Mm-hmm.
And you can see the screws.
Yeah.
And then that piece runs more or less to the... Over here, there's a cut. And they screwed this in place. Question is, if we, without replacing the trim board in here, the teak, we cannot tell if it goes from side to side or if it's only a little strip at the edge.
But from how they did this, it seems like they went the effort to do this properly and to really replace it. And look at this, Amore. There's a screw that's sort of half under here. So
that is because I didn't dig the plywood out yet. When we do it, we would also remove this little bit of plywood here.
Oh, really?
Yeah. This is not a perfect edge on just putting the new plywood here. Anyway, that's details though.
Okay, but so now that we know that this beam is not just rotten, because our fear was that this was going to be rotten and that they just attached this sister as like a quick fix without replacing the rod here, but it seems like they have replaced the rod here. So are we happy with the condition of this beam, and do we want to just do scarf joints at the end now?
No. Doing a scarf is not any easier. It's more difficult than putting in a new beam. And if you look at this by the book, then they added a sister because the repair is not giving the beam strength back that it usually has when it's laminated together in this curvature, because they just did a cut straight down. My rough plan for the moment is get the plywood off of the beam just behind it, this one here. Try to get the beam out in one piece. This one we cannot. If this one comes out, it's chiseled away in a few bits. Instead, this one I would try to get it out in one piece. And then having this one out on the workbench in one piece, I can recreate however many new beams we need. So I could make 1 or 2 new ones. And then having the 2 new beams made with the correct curvature, we can decide what we do. Are we going to replace? Are we just putting a beam as a proper sister next to this one? And then we can also put the new one into place here.
I really vote for the proper sister. I totally am in line with the idea of do it properly and do it once. Mm-hmm. But I'm also in line with the idea of don't do things you don't have to do just for the sake of it. And I think that this is a really good example of, look, we've got a beam, which is fine. It's a really huge pain in the butt to replace the whole thing. And we're messing with alignment of the cabin top. We're messing with big things.
But if you really go by the book, if this is the beam, and then you make a cut, a vertical cut, and you glue it back together, this has not the same strength as if the beam was just one piece. It's again about the fibers. The fibers start here and they end here, and here they start again and then they continue to here. That's going to snap in no time. That's why you do a scarf, because then you have a way bigger gluing surface. So that's just to say that the way this was repaired was to get rid of the rot, but they knew that it doesn't give the strength back that it needs. That's why they put the sister on.
Okay, well, if they were putting this sister on just for strength, then why did they not extend the sister to the beam shelf?
Because the beam shelf was probably, or the beam ends were probably still good when they did this repair. So it's just about strengthening the cuts that they made. I mean, that the sister is only to reconnect this part of the beam with that part of the beam, because the middle is not as strong as it was before, making straight cuts down into it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But we can do the same thing. Yeah, I mean, it would certainly be easier. Removing this sister, putting on a full sister, which runs from beam shelf to beam shelf. And what will make this even easier is, I think, proceeding with my idea of first trying to take this one out, and then we make the new beams, and once we have the new beams, then we only have to think of where and how we want to use them.
And so Aladino continued by removing the aft beam. I've mentioned before that decisions are sometimes the hardest part of a project like this, and this is another good example. How much is enough? How much is too much? What shortcuts are okay, and what shortcuts absolutely aren't okay? For now, we had a task to occupy us while we pondered these questions, and we had a list of people to call to help us through the decision. Slowly but surely, we keep moving forward.
Everybody, bring your boats. I can disassemble them. Now,
Next step is to be a reassembly expert. Well, you've already proven yourself with that.
it feels so good to have this in my hands, intact in one piece. I was curious how the carlins are attached to the beams. There's many ways of doing so. Seeing that this is the same notch like we've had in the short beams, we could assume that also this carlin is done in the same way. Go face first.
Beep,
Huh?
beep.
Oh yeah. Done.
And so Aladino set about making a new beam. These will be the last beams we make for the boat, and one of the last things we do before having to pack up for several months to reset our US visas. It's a bittersweet project.
So here it is. It's nice to see such a big beam come together. It's such important work and have that to be dealt with.
That fits perfectly.
Thank you. Here it's not as perfect yet because this one is in the way and I want to replace it. So yeah, it still needs a little bit of fitting. The curvature is perfect. I can check with this one.
And to be fair, the curvature wasn't perfect when we took it off because it did have a bit of spring back.
Yes, the curvature was not perfect.
So we had to do a little bit of planing here and there and
Totally.
adding some layers, but it's now good.
So next step though is I am making the sister, which will replace the short sister here to go full length.
So the decision was made. We'd go with a new sister beam rather than completely replacing the existing one. But of course, this wouldn't be magic carpet if we didn't go a bit over the top. So we'll share what our new over-the-top solution is in the next episode. So I'm going to leave this week's episode here. We've come a long way from this big mystery about the bridge deck and this big beam to now having a pretty solid plan in place and a new beam in place. I'm feeling quite good about where this is all going. And like Aladino alluded to, we do have the sister beam already made down on the workbench, and we didn't film the making of that one, but in the next episode we're going to be fitting that in place and hopefully closing this bridge deck up again. I am pretty happy about how this has gone because this so far has been about a week of work, and we've had other things going on in the workshop and in our surrounding lives at the same time. So I'm content because when you look at this, it looks like one big, huge, giant hole. And it is, but it hasn't actually taken up too much of our time. Also, a quick note, the next episode will be our last project video from the boatyard before we wrap up and then head back to Europe for some different adventures. This story just keeps unfolding. We're so excited to have you along with us. So thank you as always everyone for watching, and I would like to say a special thank you to our patrons who make all of these episodes possible. It's astounding to have audience support like we do, and I would also like to say an extra big thanks to the folks whose names are now appearing on screen for always going the extra mile to make sure that Magic Carpet keeps being produced. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and as always, we will see you next